Well, welcome everyone to our fall literary lecture series hosted by the Antrim Literature Project, an online public humanities platform that aims to make the study of literature accessible to readers beyond the paywalls of the university. And we're happy to offer this series of free introductory lectures on a variety of literary topics. And you can find all of the past and future recorded lectures on our database at antrimliteratureproject.org. We have the pleasure of hearing tonight Julia Rossi, a PhD student in the English department at the University of Chicago. Her research focuses on Victorian novels and the ways these novels both reflect and produce cultural and political realities. She is particularly interested in exploring how Victorian novels engage with economic history, labor history, imperialism, urban experience, and the built environment. All of these are very key to William Morris, who we'll be hearing about tonight. Julia currently lives in Paris. In addition to finishing her dissertation, she also works at the American Library in Paris, a lovely institution that provides English language books and free public events for Anglophone readers in the Paris area. Julia's lecture is titled William Morris and Victorian Medievalism. Thanks for being here, Julia.
Thank you so much. All right, without further ado, I will share my screen. So today we're going to be talking about William Morris, a British artist, designer, writer, and political thinker who lived and worked in the second half of the 19th century. There are a few things I want to accomplish in this lecture. First, I want this to be a well-rounded introduction to Morris and his work. So we're going to think about his textile designs and his involvement in the arts and crafts movement. And then we're going to turn to his literary output, focusing on his most famous novel, which is a futuristic utopia called News from Nowhere. And throughout all of this, we're going to be thinking about Morris's interest in medieval aesthetics and medieval culture, and tracing out sort of the ways medievalism operates in his novel. Ultimately, I'm hoping that at the end of today, we'll have a sense of how Morris's artwork and designs, his aesthetic philosophy, his novels, and his politics all intersected with and informed one another. So this is a photograph of William Morris. The photo was taken by a photographer named Frederick Collier in 1887. Morris, by the way, lived from 1834 to 1896. So this photo was taken just under 10 years before he died. There are other photographs of Morris, but this is by far my favorite. I think his pose here is just so incredible. He's got his head resting on his hand, which is a gesture that I associate with a kind of dreaminess. It's an informal pose. It's like the photographer has just walked in on Morris when he was deep in some kind of reverie. But then at the same time, he's staring straight at the camera. He's not looking off to the side or closing his eyes. He's got this penetrating gaze. So there's a dreaminess to his pose, but there's also a directness to it. And I think that combination of dreaminess and directness is something that gets at the heart of Morris's life and his work. Morris was interested in art and aesthetics. He was a prolific textile designer and weaver. He created gorgeous tapestries and embroideries, and he was deeply interested in architecture. He worked with an architect named Philip Webb to design his own house, which you can still visit today just outside of London. He made stained glass windows. He designed and printed gorgeous books. He was a novelist and a poet. And in addition to all of this, he was a political activist, a committed socialist, and a political thinker. Morris believed that art and politics are inseparable. He believed that truly beautiful and aesthetic objects can only be created under good and just social conditions. And he had a lot of specific thoughts and ideas on what good social conditions should look like and the kind of art that they would inspire. I think in today's political landscape, you don't often hear people talking about art or beauty. But when you read Morris's poems or his novels or his essays, you see that he's constantly thinking about aesthetics by way of thinking about social and political problems, and vice versa. So for me, when I'm feeling uninspired by contemporary political life, sometimes I like to turn to Morris to just sort of get into a different mindset. One of the things that's so fun about studying Morris is that you get to sort of fit all of the different parts of him together like a puzzle and see how they all connect. right? So there's Morris the designer, Morris the novelist, Morris the social reformer. And in his own mind, these were all facets of the same impulse in the same project. So I think we can start with what I think is the most familiar aspect of Morris popularly. If you've heard of him before, I would be willing to bet maybe like a small amount of money that you've encountered his textile and home furnishing designs. So these are 3 examples of many, many textile designs that William Morris created over the course of his life. So the first 2 are gorgeous decorative fabrics that would have been used in home furnishings, right? So to upholster pillows, for example, or to upholster chairs or cover pillows. And then the third image, this one here, is actually a section of wallpaper that Morris designed. I like to imagine sort of walking into a room with this wallpaper covering the walls. It sort of has an intense aura to it. I want to sort of curl up with a book somewhere in a corner. So I think just from looking at these examples, we can get a sense of Morris's design style. He's all about natural forms. We've got leaves, flowers, birds, strong but natural colors. He creates repeating patterns out of arrangements that feel organic and lush. Interestingly, though Morris was clearly inspired by nature, he also said that his goal was never to, quote unquote, imitate nature in his art. He wasn't trying to create an exact likeness of leaves and birds and such. So here's a really fascinating quote from him on the subject. This comes from an essay that he wrote called Some Hints on Pattern Designing. He wrote many, many essays about his artistic methods and his political beliefs. He says, "Of course you understand that it is impossible to imitate nature literally. The utmost realism of the most realistic painter falls a long way short of that. And as to the work which must be done by ordinary men, not unskilled or dull to beauty, the attempt to attain to realism would be sure to result in obscuring their intelligence, and in starving you of all the beauty which you desire in your hearts, but which you have not learned to express by means of art." I love that he uses the second person in this passage. I feel very implicated as I read it. So Morris believed that good patterns and designs should remind us of nature by combining natural forms with the human imagination, but they shouldn't try to copy nature because they'll just end up paling by comparison. Morris's circle of friends were also artists and creative types. A lot of them can be identified as members of an artistic movement called the Pre-Raphaelites, you might have heard of. He was particularly good friends with the painters Edward Burne-Jones and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Here they both are looking very dignified. So Morris and his Pre-Raphaelite friends, including Burne-Jones and Rossetti, were all interested in the medieval period. Pre-Raphaelite paintings and poems dwell on medieval stories, for example, like the legends of King Arthur and his knights. Here's an example of a painting by Rossetti that depicts a woman in a sort of medieval-inspired dress. The sitter for this painting, by the way, was Jane Morris, William Morris's wife. And she actually had an affair with Rossetti and served as model for his paintings, but that's a story for another day. So alongside some of the Pre-Raphaelites, Morris established a furnishings and decorative arts company. At first, the company was called Morris, Marshall, Faulkner & Co., named after Morris and a few of his artist friends. And then later, he assumed primary leadership and it changed to just Morris & Company. So the wallpaper and fabric designs that we looked at earlier were all made by Morris & Company. And Morris & Company, and Morris more generally, became known as major figures in a late Victorian aesthetic movement called the arts and crafts movement. So you might already be a little familiar with the arts and crafts movement. I think a lot of people have a sort of understanding of what someone means when they say that a building or a piece of furniture is of the arts and crafts movement. But oftentimes I think people are associating the movement just with its time period, which is roughly beginning in the 1880s and continuing through the early 20th century. But the arts and crafts movement doesn't just refer to that time period. It's both an artistic and a philosophical/political movement. So people who identified with the arts and crafts movement were reacting against the industrial production processes that dominated late Victorian Britain. Morris believed that the everyday items that we surround ourselves with in our homes, tables, chairs, wallpaper, curtains, etc., that they should be well made, and that each object should be made by an individual craftsman who has full control over both the creative vision for the object and the actual physical production of the object. So as I mentioned earlier, Morris and other people in his circle, the Pre-Raphaelites, as well as other people associated with the arts and crafts movement. They often worked medieval styles into their designs, and their visual artwork often depicted scenes from medieval stories. I think at first glance, Morris's investment in medievalism seems almost at odds with his politics. Morris and many of his artistic and literary associates were committed socialists, and the medieval period was, suffice to say, not exactly a socialist utopia. It was an era of feudalism. There were kings and lords, noblemen, vassals, peasants, not an egalitarian wonderland. So why is Morris so interested in a revival of medieval aesthetics? How does he come to embrace medievalism as a part of his socialism? And how do we see this playing out in his art and in his novels? Because, as I've said, on top of everything else, he was also a writer. He wrote essays, poems, and novels. And we're going to focus on his most famous novel called News from Nowhere, which was published in 1890, so toward the end of his life. News from Nowhere is actually not the full title of the novel. So in a very typical Victorian fashion, the real full title is a real mouthful. It's called News from Nowhere, or An Epoch of Rest, being some chapters from a utopian romance. I think he's playing really fast and loose with syntax in this title. The being some part always trips me up, being some chapters from a utopian romance. So I'd like to take a minute to sit with this title and think about how Morris is using a lot of these really big terms and how the title alone sort of captures some of the salient features of the novel. First, a word that stands out to me here is utopian. News from Nowhere is very much working within the genre of utopian fiction. So that is, of course, a story that's set in a world where everything is perfect, or at least perfect according to the ideals of the author, I should say. Earlier examples of utopian literature go all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Thomas More actually coined the term utopia in the year 1516 when he wrote a book that he called Utopia. And with that title, Thomas More was sort of bringing together the Greek prefix ou, meaning not, and the Greek word topos, meaning place. So ou plus topos becomes utopia, or literally translated, it means nowhere, no place, right? And Thomas More's novel depicts a fictional island that he calls Utopia. So when Morris calls his novel News from Nowhere, he's sort of playfully invoking this literary tradition or genre of utopian writing. And he's doubly reinforcing that illusion when he explicitly calls this novel also News from Nowhere, a utopian romance. So we've covered utopia, we've covered nowhere. Two other words that I think are critical to Morris's project in this title are news and rest. So let's start with rest. Here, part of the title, remember, is An Epoch of Rest. Here, Morris is taking aim at the Victorian period's obsession with understanding itself as a period of fast-paced change or growth, or quote unquote progress, right? Morris's idea of a utopian future is one where the progress mentality that's so pervasive in politics and the culture of his time has been replaced by a different rhythm of life, a kind of contentedness, a kind of contented stasis or rest, right? And then before we move on, also news. So Morris is writing from a time when newspapers and the periodical press had a lot of power. Rising literacy rates combined with improved printing technologies meant that newspapers were everywhere. And he's being a little ironic when he calls this novel News from Nowhere, because he's really trying to imagine a world without news, or rather a world beyond news, right? This is an epoch of rest. It's a society that isn't subject to the churning social and political upheavals of his day. So part of what's utopian about this society is, in fact, the absence of news. But then at the same time, the utopian world that he's rendering in this novel is certainly news to us, the readers, right? It's like he's a reporter reporting to us on what social life could be like if we overcame the perils of capitalism and industrialism. So I think it might be wise to give a quick plot summary of News from Nowhere. Essentially, it's a time traveling story. We begin in Morris's own time in 1890s England. And we begin with a working class Victorian man who is a committed socialist who despairs at the rampant poverty and inequality that surrounds him. He attends a meeting with other socialists and he gets into a fight at the meeting and he goes home feeling pretty hopeless and he goes to bed. When he wakes up in the morning, he feels great. He feels like the air is clearer, his mood is better, it's a really good day. He goes outside and he quickly realizes that everything's changed. He's not in 1890s England anymore. He's in England in around the year 2090, or 200 years in the future from where Morris is writing. And everyone in the future is beautiful and happy. And he meets a cheerful young man who takes him on a journey by boat along the River Thames throughout England. And they stop every once in a while to talk to people. And he learns that soon after his own time in the 1890s, in the late Victorian period, there was a socialist revolution, and the working classes managed to overthrow capitalism and reorganize society. So he asks a bunch of questions to everyone he meets, and they explain their utopian ways to him and their utopian history. In the end, depressingly, he gets sucked back into his own time, where people are poor and class hierarchies are rigid, but he's filled with renewed energy and hope for a better future. That's actually a pretty thorough summary. It's a very simple novel in terms of plot and character. Most of the energy from the story comes from our narrator reveling in all of the details of utopian life, describing the social norms and the physical details that he encounters, right? Architecture, clothing, furniture, etc. I think oftentimes when speaking for myself, at least when I read a novel, I expect to get either really elaborate plots or really psychologically deep and interesting characters, or preferably both. But the characters in News from Nowhere are extraordinarily straightforward. They're remarkably simple as characters. It's not that they're all exactly the same. They have different preferences, different inclinations and such. And they're not entirely without conflict, interestingly. They have romantic difficulties, for example. There's one couple that breaks up and gets back together by the end of the novel. But they're not subject to the same social pressures and hierarchies and cultural expectations and personal pathologies that we often get in novels that produce really vivid characters. And actually, interestingly, at a few moments in the novel, characters explicitly say that novels and history books still do exist in Utopia, but they've sort of fallen by the wayside. So in one scene, a beautiful young woman is talking to her grandfather. And the grandfather is one of the few people in the Utopia who still talks a lot about books. And the young woman gets tired of him talking about books. And she says, "Books, books, always books, grandfather. When will you understand that after all, it is the world we live in which interests us, the world of which we are a part, and which we can never love too much? Look," she said, throwing open the casement wider and showing us the white light sparkling between the black shadows of the moonlit garden, through which ran a little shiver of the summer night wind. "Look, these are our books in these days." I find this moment really fascinating. Here is Morris writing a book. He's writing a novel, and within that novel, he's suggesting that novels and books in general are the cultural outputs of a flawed world. That if we lived in a more beautiful and just society, we wouldn't be spending as much time reading books, which is a provocative thought. I think Morris is very aware that people might read his novel and say, these characters are one-dimensional, they're not very interesting. And to him, this is a natural consequence of the fact that they live in Utopia. Sure, they have disagreements with one another and romantic entanglements and such, but they don't have wars, they don't have class struggles, they don't have a lot of the chaos going on that makes for interesting novels and novelistic characters. All right, so as I've sort of prefaced, medieval culture and medieval aesthetics play a significant role in this novel. It comes up actually almost immediately. At the beginning, when our narrator is in 1890s England, before he wakes up in Utopia, he's walking home and he passes an ugly suspension bridge. The part of London where he lives is called Hammersmith. It's the same part of London that Morris lived in when he was writing News from Nowhere. And Morris's lodgings would have actually had a clear view of Hammersmith Bridge, which is the very same bridge that Morris is describing as ugly in the novel. Here's a photograph of Hammersmith Bridge from around the time when Morris is writing. And when our narrator first wakes up in Utopia, he doesn't immediately realize that he's traveled in time. He goes out and he thinks, the water's really clear today, the air feels really good today, but he doesn't think, I must be in the future. One of his first big signals, his first big clues that he's living in a different time is that the ugly bridge has been replaced by a distinctly medieval bridge. So here's a passage for us to consider. Sorry, it's a bit long. I turned my bewildered eyes eastward to look at the bridge again, and thence to the shores of the London River, and surely there was enough to astonish me. For though there was a bridge across the stream and houses on its banks, how all was changed from last night. The soapworks with their smoke-vomiting chimneys were gone, the engineers' works gone, the leadworks gone, and no sound of riveting and hammering came down the west wind from Thornycroft's. Then the bridge. I had perhaps dreamed of such a bridge, but never seen such a one out of an illuminated manuscript, for not even the Ponte Vecchio at Florence came anywhere near it. It was of stone arches, splendidly solid, and as graceful as they were strong, high enough also to let ordinary river traffic through easily. Over the parapet showed quaint and fanciful little buildings, which I suppose to be booths or shops, beset with painted and gilded vanes and spiralets. The stone was a little weathered, but showed no marks of the grimy sootiness which I was used to on every London building more than a year old. In short, to me, a wonder of a bridge. So to give you a sense of what he's describing, he compares the Utopian bridge to the Ponte Vecchio in Florence, which was built in the year 1345. Though he says the futuristic Utopian bridge is even better, right? Not even the Ponte Vecchio at Florence came anywhere near to it. So here's a painting of the Ponte Vecchio. And when we look at this painting, we can see what Morris's narrator is talking about when he says that there are little shops along the bridge itself. You see those beautiful little 3 arches in the center with the little rooftops sort of radiating out on either side of the bridge. So let's consider the passage again as a whole. I think it's important that before our narrator launches into his odd description of the bridge, he notices something else that's different about his surroundings from Victorian times. He says, for though there was a bridge across the stream and houses on its banks, how all was changed from last night, right? The soapworks with their smoke vomiting chimneys were gone, the engineers' works gone, etc., right? And in this moment, the quaint, dreamlike, distinctly medieval bridge is associated with the absence of industrial work sites. So I think this is a moment in the text where we can really see the aesthetics and the politics of Morris's medievalism sort of coming together. Morris believed that industrialization had sucked the spirit out of society and ruined our relationship to work, to labor. Industrial production, in Morris's view, turned workers into machines. Instead of workers having full control over what they produce, they're put into factories, and the production of a single object is broken down into a bunch of stages. And each worker only gets to work on one stage over and over and over again, right? Another term for this fragmentation of labor into small pieces is called the division of labor. We're probably familiar with that term. I wanted to look actually very quickly at a very famous passage by the classical economist Adam Smith in his book, The Wealth of Nations. So this is the moment where Smith introduces the concept of the division of labor. And he's talking about the work that goes into producing pins, like literal pins, that you would use to sew or to hold clothing together. And he says, it used to be that a single person would be responsible for making an entire pin from start to finish. But that wasn't very efficient, right? So now with factories and the division of labor, we can make more pins than ever before in less time. So here's the excerpt. One man draws out the wire, another straightens it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds it. At the top for receiving the head. To make the pin requires 2 or 3 distinct operations. To put it on is a peculiar business. To whiten the pins is another. It is even a trade by itself to put them onto the paper. And the important business of making a pin is, in this manner, divided into about 18 distinct operations, which in some manufactories are all performed by distinct hands. Right? So Morris hates the division of labor. And he says, sure, it makes production more efficient, but it also shatters the human soul in the process. And throughout his writing, including in News from Nowhere, he turns to medieval culture because he's fascinated by what life was like before industrial production processes took hold. So medieval culture comes to stand for him for a time when workers were craftsmen and not cogs in a machine. I pulled a passage from one of Morris's more famous political essays where he's discussing this. And you'll see he's locating a difference between how people worked in the medieval period and how people work in the 18th and 19th centuries. It almost reads actually like a rebuttal to Adam Smith's pin passage. So this essay is called The Hopes of Civilization, and here's the passage. I have said that the 18th century perfected the system of labor, which took the place of the medieval system, under which a workman individually carried his piece of work all through its various stages from the first to the last. This new system, the first change in industrial production since the Middle Ages, is known as the system of division of labor, wherein, as I said, the unit of labor is a group, not a man. The individual workman in this system is kept lifelong at the performance of some task quite petty in itself, and which he soon masters, and having mastered it, has nothing more to do but to go on increasing his speed of hand under the spur of competition with his fellows, until he has become the perfect machine, which it is his ultimate duty to become. since without attaining to that end, he must die or become a pauper. You can well imagine how this glorious invention of division of labor, this complete destruction of individuality in the workman, and his apparent hopeless enslavement to his profit-grinding master, stimulated the hopes of civilization. Probably more hymns have been sung in praise of division of labor, more sermons preached about it, than have done homage to the precept, do unto others as ye would they should do unto you. So I hope this has helped us to see how, for Morris, the medieval design of the bridge in Utopia, right? This bridge that's reminiscent of the Ponte Vecchio, except much better. It goes hand in hand with his vision for what the British landscape, both the physical landscape and the social landscape, would look like without industrialization. And I think it's also important to linger on the detail that Morris says the bridge is reminiscent of the Ponte Vecchio, but somehow indescribably is far superior. Remember, he says, not even the Ponte Vecchio at Florence came anywhere near it. I think this is actually a critical part of how Morris leverages medievalism in his writing and in his art. He's not interested in trying to just reinstate the social forms of the Middle Ages. He doesn't want to go back to feudalism, to kings and lords and peasants. What he wants is to use medieval design and style as a kind of inspiration, a jumping off point that we can use to imagine a different kind of world. And the world that he's imagining in this novel is futuristic, not historical. So before we move on from this passage, I want to dwell on one more detail. Let's return to the passage. Here we go. Then the bridge, that's where I'm starting. Then the bridge. I had perhaps dreamed of such a bridge, but never seen such a one out of an illuminated manuscript, for not even the Ponte Vecchio at Florence came anywhere near it. So just in case this term isn't familiar for anyone, an illuminated manuscript is a handwritten book with highly detailed and decorative pages. Often illuminated manuscripts contain illustrations and elaborate borders, right? And they're painted with beautiful and bold colors, mostly associated with the medieval period. So here's an example of a late medieval illuminated manuscript, a very beautiful one. Morris was deeply interested in illuminated manuscripts, and he would often make trips to the Bodleian Library in Oxford to examine the illuminated manuscripts in their collection. He became really interested in bookmaking as a form of art, and in the ways these medieval decorative practices can enrich the experience of reading a text. So inspired by the styles of illuminated manuscripts, toward the end of his life, Morris founded his own printing press called the Kelmscott Press. And he designed typefaces, layouts, page borders, illustrations that sort of blend a medieval inspired style with more advanced printing technologies. And the goal of the Kelmscott Press was to revive bookmaking as a fine art or craft instead of just churning out mass-produced cheap texts. So again, we can see how Morris's fixation with medieval style gets braided into his philosophy of labor. He's longing to vanquish the ways of industrial production, factory systems, the division of labor, and to return to labor as craftsmanship, such that a single person has control over the entire process of creating an object from start to finish. And he sort of lives out that manifesto with his decorative arts company, Morris and Company, but then he also turns that spirit on book production with the Kelmscott Press. So this is an edition of News from Nowhere that Morris himself designed and typeset and printed with the Kelmscott Press. You can see immediately how gorgeously ornamental it is. The first sentence of the novel starts with the phrase "up at the League." So the letter U is the first letter of the novel. On the right-hand side of the page, we see this like magnificently large and decorative U. The border, again, extremely reminiscent of the pattern designs that he came up with in his textile productions, right? Okay, so I should have said that he designed the typeface for this book as well. So let's turn to another passage from the novel. I apologize if it's a little long. It's just very full of interesting stuff. So I couldn't figure out where to cut. Okay, so there were houses about, some on the road, some amongst the fields with pleasant lanes leading down to them, and each surrounded by a teeming garden. They were all pretty in design, and as solid as might be, but countrified in appearance, like yeomen's dwellings, some of them of red brick, like those by the river, but more of timber and plaster, which were by the necessity of their construction so like medieval houses of the same materials that I fairly felt as if I were alive in the 14th century, a sensation helped out by the costume of the people that we met or passed, in whose dress there was nothing modern. Almost everybody was gaily dressed, but especially the women, who were so well-looking, or even so handsome, that I could scarcely refrain my tongue from calling my companion's attention to the fact. Some faces I saw that were thoughtful, and in these I noticed great nobility of expression, but none that had a glimmer of unhappiness, and the greater part, who came upon a great many people, were frankly open and openly joyous. I thought I knew the broad way by the lie of the roads that still met there. On the north side of the road was a range of buildings and courts, low but very handsomely built and ornamented, and in that way forming a great contrast to the unpretentiousness of the houses round about, while above this lower building rose a steep lead-covered roof and the buttresses and higher part of the wall of a great hall of a splendid and exuberant style of architecture, of which one can say little more than that it seems to me to embrace the best qualities of the Gothic of Northern Europe with those of the Saracenic and Byzantine, though there was no copying of any of these styles. On the other, the south side of the road was an octagonal building with a high roof, not unlike the baptistry in Florence in outline, except that it was surrounded by a lean-to that clearly made an arcade or cloisters to it. It also was most delicately ornamented. This whole mass of architecture, which we came upon so suddenly from amidst the pleasant fields, was not only exquisitely beautiful in itself, but it bore upon it the expression of such generosity and abundance of life that I was exhilarated to a pitch I had never yet reached. I fairly chuckled for pleasure. So I think there's so much going on in this passage. I'm going to limit myself to just a few observations. I want to start by emphasizing that, again, what he's giving us here is sort of a fantasy version of the Middle Ages, right? He's not describing a scene that ever actually existed in history. It's a futuristic scene, but one with medieval aesthetics. So let's delve into some details. First, countrified in appearance, like yeomen's dwellings, when he's describing the houses that he's encountering here. So Morris is writing at a time when the population of London was exploding. The city was becoming denser than it had ever been before. Parts of the city were deeply overcrowded. And so part of the dreaminess of the landscape that he's imagining in this novel, part of what makes it utopian to him, is that there's plenty of room for modestly sized houses, each with their own teeming garden, he says here, right? And they're likened to medieval yeomen's dwellings. And then there's a lot going on in the second paragraph. So I'll briefly point to a few things. First, this moment, he said he's describing a splendid and exuberant style of architecture, of which one can say little more than that it seems to me to embrace the best qualities of the Gothic of Northern Europe with those of the Saracenic and Byzantine, though there was no copying of any of these styles, right? So it's interesting that here Morris is depicting the utopian landscape as a kind of mashup of different medieval cultural styles, right? He's not just pulling from English medieval architecture here, though usually he's focused on English medieval architecture. He's turning to Northern Europe and also further east to the Byzantine Empire. And again, he makes a point of saying that the buildings in Utopia are reminiscent of these medieval buildings, though there was no copying of any of these styles. This sort of reminds me of the passage that we looked at earlier, when Morris is writing about how good design should draw inspiration from nature without trying to copy or imitate nature, right? He's doing something similar, I think, with medieval style. He's insisting that the futuristic people of his imagined society have not just looked in history books and copied medieval designs. Medieval style functions for him more as a way to sort of imaginatively render a post-industrial world. But he doesn't want to just reinstate or resurrect the Middle Ages. Okay, there's tons of other details about this passage. We can talk, if you are interested, in the Q&A perhaps about the role of women in his futuristic utopia, which I think we can see going on here. Our Victorian narrator, I love this moment when he says, I could scarcely refrain my tongue from calling my companion's attention to the fact of the beauty of these women, right? It's an interesting moment, and this sort of thing happens again and again in the novel, where our Victorian novel almost embarrasses himself by remarking on things that are just sort of free and obvious to the utopian people, which is interesting. Let's see. Okay, I guess we can conclude on this moment here in the last paragraph. He says, this whole massive architecture which we came upon so suddenly from amidst the pleasant fields was not only exquisitely beautiful in itself, but it bore upon it the expression of such generosity and abundance of life that I was exhilarated to a pitch that I had never yet reached. So I love the phrasing here because I think it gets really at the heart of the way that Morris thinks about art and architecture. Morris believed that you can read the health of a society, a given society, and the values of that society. That you can read those values by looking at the art and architecture that that society produces, right? So when he says that the architecture in Utopia bore upon it the expression of such generosity and abundance of life, he's saying that the freedom of the craftsmen who made these buildings is legible, is visible in the buildings themselves. Okay, I think I could go on and on about Morris and his designs and news from nowhere, but I will cut myself off here. And I'm delighted to speak with you all more and to hear your thoughts.